So I want to switch just a bit and talk a little about the book you co-authored and edited called Beyond the Asterisk: Understanding Native Students in Higher Education. Mm-hmm. Now, you provide in that book information for lots of higher education institutions, including tribal colleges. So what were some of the tips you provided to tribal colleges specifically?
Well, in terms of tribal colleges, the tips are really geared towards mainstream, or what we termed non-native colleges and universities in the book, really geared towards the partnerships between those two institutions. Okay. And I'll focus on two things. The first is that tribal colleges really do a fabulous job of serving Native students. Mm-hmm. That's what they were chartered for. That's what their mission and purpose is. In fact, the three things that set apart tribal colleges are that they must be tribally chartered, that their board must, the majority of their governing boards must be Native American, and the majority of their students, 51%, must be Native American. And so what is really great, and actually non-native colleges and universities could learn a lot from tribal colleges about how to serve Native students, because you'll find that often there's a real family approach, more of a holistic approach to serving students and viewing the student as a whole person and serving all of their needs, not just thinking about them as compartmentalized people and only seeing them in the classroom and maybe in activities, but really seeing them as whole people that have a multitude of needs. And so we see out of tribal colleges probably one of the more profound retention models that we have seen for Native students came out of a tribal college at Iris Heavy Runner, the family education model, that really talks about how to support Native students with that thought of the expanded family, the extended family kind of concept, but also incorporating the student's family into serving them and supporting them in higher education. So I think that there's a lot to learn from tribal colleges and how they approach serving Native students and working with them, particularly from a cultural standpoint. So not just in incorporating tribal culture, but really coming from that place. So you'll find often that services in tribal colleges for students, or the curricula, how classes are taught, really come from a tribal perspective and really come from a cultural perspective, which is probably why Native students who are in tribal colleges tend to really succeed. So they get that attention and that cultural base attended to. But the other thing that we offer in the book talks about partnerships between mainstream institutions and tribal colleges. And so historically we've seen these partnerships that happen that tend to be a little more one-sided. So non-native colleges and universities, so you have these generally larger research institutions will approach tribal colleges for maybe it's a grant or it's a research project, but it's generally something that's benefiting the larger institution, and they need access to Native students or to a tribal college. It's really historically been a little bit one-sided. And so what we offer in the book, in fact, Dr. Justin Guillory authored a really wonderful chapter specifically about those partnerships between non-native colleges and universities and TCUs. And Dr. Guillory, who's now the president of Northwest Indian College, talks about some of those struggles and what prevents those partnerships between these two types of institutions, which is really unfortunate because there's a lot that we can learn from one another both ways, and a lot of work that we can do together that could benefit both our communities and our institutions. And so he talks a lot about in the book, and particularly in his chapter, how mainstream institutions should approach tribal colleges, and that it can't really be this attitude of paternalism or benevolence, but that TCUs really do have a lot of knowledge to offer mainstream institutions, and that there has to be something that tribal colleges are getting out of that partnership. It has to be a two-way street, and that really it has to, in that partnership, it has to be a true partnership from the beginning, that it can't be a university approaching a TCU with an idea already in hand, and here's your part. That it really should be a collaborative effort where they're working from the beginning, really thinking through whatever project it may be, whether it's a research project, if it's a grant, if it's a research grant, whatever it might be, that they're working together and that there's some equity there in the relationship. And so, those are some of the things that we offer. Then, also from the student perspective, thinking about some of those tips are that that there has to be a connection between TCUs and non-native colleges and universities, because many of the students who are at TCUs will be transferring to our four-year institutions. And so how do we create a seamless transfer? Right. And we have to have those relationships between these types of institutions so that we can create that transition into a mainstream institution, because you have to imagine coming from a tribal college where everything's been from a tribal perspective. Your culture has been not only respected but been central to everything that you've been doing, and coming into an institution where Native students tend to be marginalized is not always an easy transition. So how do we create that transition so it's a little more seamless? How do we make sure that those students are being served? How do we create those partnerships that reach across institutions so that our students benefit in the end?